Welcome back to Calluna Vineyards on this quite cool but very beautiful morning. And I want to talk about one of the really very most important operations in a vineyard. This time of year in the winter, it is for sure more quiet in the vineyard, but there is, again, this one very important operation called pruning of the vineyard. And it is indeed a big operation because we have 35,000 vines on this property, and each one of them has to be pruned by hand. So let's take a walk to the vineyard and let me show you what we want to end up with first as we look at this process. So let's take a look at a vine the way we want it to end up. I often think it's easiest to discuss and explain pruning when I talk about what the final product is. Then we'll go back and look at how we got here given the jumble that the vine was at the end of the growing season last year. But this is the end product that we want. Our form of pruning is known as cane pruning. There is another important one called Cordon Pruning, and I'll explain that in a minute. But we use cane pruning, which is very prominent and really the only thing used in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and most European vineyards. So the end product that we want is just the trunk of our vine and two what we call canes that are tied to the cane wire. So in our system, the only permanent part of this plant is the trunk. And the only way you'll know how old the vine is by looking at the trunk. Because overall, this plant is never going to get bigger, taller, in any respect, except for the fact that the trunk gets wider. So these vines are about, 16 years old now. But at the end of each year, we choose two canes that are closest to the head of the plant and are substantial enough to make for next year's shoots and fruit ultimately. And when I say that the trunk is the only permanent part of the plant, that's because this wood is known as one-year-old wood. It wasn't there 2 years ago. It grew this year. And so we select that, we cut back to it, we leave about 5 buds on each of these canes, and from these buds will come next year's shoots that will grow up and will tuck into our trellis system here. So all the shoots will come up like this. And on the shoots from these buds, at the lower part will be generally 2 clusters, sometimes 1, sometimes they push 3, but generally we're looking to get 1 or 2 clusters from each of these buds. So therefore, this plant is going to produce 10 to possibly 20 clusters. 20 clusters would be a lot for the plant, so we don't expect that. We might drop some of that fruit to bring it back. But in any event, that is what we're looking for. Now, let me just mention quickly that there is one other very big, prominently featured form of pruning in Sonoma and Napa, which is called cordon pruning, as I mentioned. And cordon is one where the trunk of the plant is brought up and goes out laterally. So you actually have trunk going this way. Sometimes quad cordon, where 2 sections of trunk are going out to spread the canopy more. That is a different approach. Sure, you can make great wine. Like many of these things, there are more than one way of making great wine. But this is the method we choose, and we think there are some advantages. So let's go back now and see how we got here. So now we're going to take a step back and show you an unpruned vine and how we prune it down to its trunk and the 2 canes. So our great foreman of our vineyard management team, Jose Rosas, is going to come along and show you how to do this. And you can see Jose starts cutting away and looking at which of the canes he wants to keep and cutting away the others. So on the right-hand side, he's going to choose this cane and cut away everything else. And on the left-hand side, or to his right as he moves over there. He's choosing between the one that's a little higher up and the one that's lower down. So finally, he cuts away the one that's lower down and chooses that one that's higher. You don't want to get it too high, but that's just fine. So there it is, and he'll come back later to complete the job by tying those canes down onto the cane wire. So I was doing a Zoom tasting this week, and I had two related questions that I thought I'd talk about this evening. The first one is, what is a Bordeaux wine? So that's a pretty basic question. But the other related one was, what makes a wine from California more Bordeaux-like? So that is a much more complex question. As to the first one, a Bordeaux wine is a wine made in the Bordeaux region of France. And let's talk about the red wines in this case. It's made up of those traditional Bordeaux varietals, meaning Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc, and then much smaller doses of Petit Verdot and Malbec. And Malbec actually is pretty scarce in Bordeaux these days. But wines made up with those blends from that area are the red wines of Bordeaux. So now, what makes a wine in California more Bordeaux-like? It's somewhat a tricky question. The Bordeaux wines are grown in a climate that is generally a little cooler than our area. And so the sort of the aromatic and structural profile of those wines are a little what we call cooler, meaning a little more structured with acid and tannin, and generally not as high in sugar and therefore alcohol from those grapes. Now, I'm very conscious about the background of Bordeaux. I work in Bordeaux, and I've sort of collected Bordeaux wines for a long time. So I'm cognizant of this issue, but no winemaker would say, I want to make wines like Bordeaux, because we want to make wines from our own terroir. I am working with the same grapes, and the fact that I've chosen a somewhat cooler area to grow these in the Chalk Hill appellation, and the fact that my mindset is for very traditional winemaking, my wines do taste sometimes a bit like Bordeaux wines, and people will say that. Whether that's a compliment or not depends on the person speaking. But in any event, those are the things that tend to drive it, the climate and also the winemaker's mindset. But this has given me an idea for our wine tasting this evening. We would pull a Bordeaux wine to try against one of our own wines. And I just happen to have a 14 Aubage Liberal, which is made by our neighbor. And I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And I'm going to get a wine I had open today, a 14 Calluna Estate. Okay, so we've got a really nice Bordeaux wine to try against our Calluna Estate. These are both 2014 wines. This wine is Chateau Aubage Liberal from the Pauillac area of Bordeaux. This is made by our neighbors here in California, who happen to be very prominent chateau owners in Bordeaux. Bought a piece of land very close to us here. That's Gonzague Lurton and Claire Villars Lurton. So it is really fun to try our 14s against each other. So their wine, as I understand it, is probably about 75% Cabernet, and maybe some Merlot or perhaps Cab Franc after that. I don't know, but it is that Pauillac area Cabernet-driven wine. The 14 Calluna Estate has all 5 of those Bordeaux varietals we spoke at, with Cabernet Sauvignon at 58%. So the blend is somewhat similar. And they're both excellent wines, as I tend to feel. But they are different, even though, again, people might say my wines are Bordeaux-like because of the cooler area I grow in and the way I make wine. They really are fairly distinct. That this is still grown in a somewhat cooler area. the Bordeaux wine, so it's a little bit leaner. I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but a little more acid, a little bit more earth tones, savory tones. Probably the alcohol level's a little bit lower. My wines are always on the moderate side at like 14.1, but this is probably less. And so that gives it like a lighter body, and yet there's still intensity on the palate. So I think it's just a perfect example of the difference between California Bordeaux varietals and a wine made in Bordeaux. There is that prominent difference still.